September 28th, 1944. Warsaw lay in ruins. Entire districts had collapsed into ash-grey canyons, their foundations cracked open, their windows hollow and watching like dead eyes. Smoke drifted through streets where silence felt heavier than rubble, and inside one of those shattered shells, a cold, abandoned apartment on Aleja Niepodległości. A starving man in a torn coat pressed himself against a wall, barely able to stand. His name was Władysław Szpilman, and he had not touched a piano in months. A German officer stepped through the doorway. His boots crushed broken plaster. His breath echoed in the empty room, and Szpilman froze, skeletal, shaking, gripping nothing but the faint hope that the soldier would overlook the human shadow trembling before him. The officer raised his pistol. Then, instead of firing, he paused, eyes narrowing not in cruelty, but in something closer to disbelief. Before him stood a man who looked more ghost than living a Jewish pianist, who should not have survived this long in a city being erased. The officer lowered his weapon, slowly, a decision that could end his own life, if anyone ever discovered it. Long before that moment, long before he looked into the eyes of a starving musician, that officer had lived a very different life. His name was Wilm Hosenfeld. Born in Mackenzell, raised in a devout, disciplined Catholic family, he grew up believing in service, in duty, in the idea that good men protected the vulnerable, not hunted them. Before the war, he had been a schoolteacher, a husband, a father to 5 children, a man who taught young students to think, to question, to act with conscience. Germany's descent into fanaticism horrified him early on. He wrote in his diary about the brutality around him, the beatings, the deportations, the quiet disappearances. He condemned them privately, silently, in the only place where honesty was still safe. Yet he wore the uniform, bound by mobilization, by obligation, by a war he had never wanted to fight. By 1944, stationed in Warsaw, he had seen enough. Too many executions, too many empty homes, too many lives reduced to numbers on lists. His sense of duty remained, but its meaning had changed. He no longer believed obedience was loyalty. Loyalty, he felt, belonged to the human beings caught beneath the weight of orders. And so, when he pushed open the door of that ruined apartment, he entered not as a hunter, but as a man already questioning his own side. Szpilman could barely stand as the officer approached. His face was hollow from months spent hiding like a trapped animal. Every breath seemed stolen. His fingers, once precise, elegant tools that danced over pianos in Warsaw's grand halls, now shook as though even the memory of music required strength he no longer possessed. The officer studied him, quietly, with a strange mix of authority and empathy. Then he asked the question that shifted the gravity of the room, "What do you do?" Szpilman answered with the only truth he had left. "I'm a pianist." The officer stepped back, eyes lingering not on the man but on the dusty upright piano in the corner, the only object spared by looters, perhaps because it was too heavy to steal. He pointed to it. "Play?" Szpilman hesitated, terrified that his hands would betray him, terrified he would fail this impossible test, terrified that the wrong note could mean execution. But he walked to the piano, placed his fingers on its cold key, and pressed lightly. A sound emerged, thin, cracked, fragile, but real, a pulse of life in a city of death. And as the notes echoed through the destroyed apartment, so did the final line of this moment, carried quietly between a starving pianist and the German officer, who now faced a choice no uniform could dictate. He listened and made the first decision that would save a life. The final notes trembled into silence, fading into the hollow corridors of the ruined apartment. Hosenfeld stood without moving, as if the music had reached a part of him the war had not yet destroyed. The uniform on his shoulders represented a nation tearing Europe apart. Yet in that moment, listening to a starving man coax life from a broken piano, he felt only the weight of what Germany had lost, and what it had taken. Szpilman's hands dropped from the keys, his chest rose and fell in shallow, frightened breaths. He waited for judgment, a command, an accusation, a gunshot. Instead, the officer exhaled slowly, as if steadying something inside himself. He reached into his pocket. Szpilman flinched, expecting a weapon, but Hosenfeld pulled out a small ration, a piece of bread, rough and dense, wrapped in thin paper. He He placed it gently on the windowsill as though offering it to a wounded bird. Spielmann stared, unable to speak. Food meant survival. Food meant days more hidden from a city determined to erase him. And this officer, this enemy, had just handed him life outside. Warsaw smouldered. The uprising had collapsed. German units hunted survivors through the rubble. Patrols swept buildings one by one. Every alley echoed with distant bursts of gunfire. Any man discovered helping a Jew risked execution. Swift, public, merciless. Hosenfeld knew this. He had seen the punishments. He had even been ordered to oversee some but something in the pianist's trembling chords, had cut through years of reluctant obedience. He asked Spielmann where he had been hiding, how long he had been surviving alone, what he still had left. Spielmann answered softly, ashamed by how weak his voice sounded. His food was gone, his coat was thin, winter was approaching. The building around him had no heat, no water, barely any shelter. Staying here meant death, slow, silent, inevitable. The officer surveyed the room with a tactician's eye. He noticed the broken window sealed with scraps of wood, the scorched wallpaper, the empty cans, the hollow cheeks of the man standing before him. He didn't see an enemy. He saw someone clinging to the last thread of life in a city that had forgotten mercy. Hosenfeld walked back into the hallway. The stairs groaned beneath his boots. For a brief moment, Spielmann thought he had been abandoned, spared but left to die. But then the officer returned, carrying something heavy draped over his arm, a thick military coat. He handed it to Spielmann without a word. It hung loosely on his skeletal frame, but warmth flooded through the worn fabric. The gesture carried no dramatics, no speech, no explanation. Only necessity. Only humanity. "Stay here," Hosenfeld said quietly. "I will come back." Then he stepped out into the ruined world, closing the door behind him with a soft click that felt like a promise. For the next days, true to his word, he returned, cautiously, discreetly at hours when patrols passed elsewhere. He brought bread, canned vegetables, even a little jam once, apologizing that it was all he could find. He studied the building's angles, learned which walls hid sound, which windows were safest, which routes offered cover from passing units. He taught Spielmann how to remain unseen. Each visit carried enormous risk. Any German officer who discovered him could arrest him on the spot. Any report, any casual remark, any misplaced suspicion could end not only his career, but his life. Yet Hosenfeld continued, not out of strategy, but out of quiet moral defiance. The belief that one life, even in the ruins of Warsaw, still mattered. And in those silent days, the bond between a starving pianist and a disillusioned officer deepened into something neither could have predicted. A fragile, dangerous thread of trust born inside a collapsing city. In the weeks that followed, Warsaw descended even further into silence. Snow gathered on the ruins, softening the jagged skeletons of buildings, muting the echoes of distant gunfire. Winter tightened around the city with a quiet cruelty, turning every cracked window into a draught of freezing air. Inside the abandoned apartment, Spielmann survived hour to hour, each breath sustained by the food Hosenfeld risked everything to provide. The officer's visits grew more careful. He moved like a man navigating a minefield, waiting for patrol schedules to shift, avoiding familiar routes, blending into the routine of German withdrawal as the Eastern Front approached. The Soviet offensive was pushing toward the Vistula, and German command knew Warsaw was lost. Units packed equipment, documents burned in courtyards. Rumours circulated of sudden arrests, of soldiers vanishing after being accused of disloyalty. Suspicion hung in the air like smoke. Hosenfeld understood the danger better than anyone. He had already stretched the boundaries of duty for months, helping Polish civilians, securing work papers for prisoners, intervening where he could without drawing attention. But this was different. Hiding a Jewish musician in a condemned building was a clear act of treason. Each time he climbed the stairwell, each time he opened the apartment door, he risked walking into his own execution. Yet his determination only sharpened. He began bringing not just food, but information. He warned Spielmann which streets were unsafe, which units were moving out, which commissaries still held supplies. He taught him to gather water from melted snow, to stay near the stove even when it produced no heat, to ration food in a way that stretched days instead of hours. And each evening, when he returned to the barracks, He wrote quietly in his diary, lines that would not be read until long after the war. "We are destroying ourselves. I cannot understand it anymore." Spielmann listened to these updates without speaking much. His body remained fragile, but his mind stirred back to life. He began rebuilding his strength in small ways, pacing the room, clearing debris around the piano, running his fingers gently over the keys. The music didn't return as sound. It returned first as memory, as muscle patterns, as the faintest recollection of Chopin phrases he once played effortlessly. But it was enough. It reminded him he was still human. Outside, the final phase of the war edged closer. Soviet artillery could be heard faintly to the east, a low, distant rumble like a coming storm. German units prepared to evacuate. Files were shredded, orders tightened. The city, once a vibrant centre of culture, had become a silent battleground between collapse and liberation. One afternoon, Hosenfeld arrived with urgency in his step. His face showed the strain of a man who had run out of time. He set down the food, more than usual, and looked around the apartment as if memorizing every corner. Spielmann sensed something shift, something heavier than the winter air. Hosenfeld explained quietly. The German forces were retreating. He would be reassigned. This might be his last visit. He pressed his gloves into Spielmann's hands, urging him to conserve warmth, to stay hidden until the Soviets arrived. He repeated instructions, where to look for safe water, how to avoid patrols, how to identify the moment the front line changed. Then, as he reached the door, he turned back. For the first time, his voice carried something close to emotion. "If you survive," he said softly, "remember." The rest remained unspoken, because the war allowed no room for sentiment. He stepped into the hallway, boots echoing once, then fading down the ruined stairwell. Spielmann stood motionless long after the sound disappeared. Holding the gloves of the officer who had kept him alive outside, the snow continued falling over Warsaw, and over a pianist waiting alone in the ruins for the world to change. Days blurred into one another after Hosenfeld's final visit. The city outside the shattered windows groaned under the weight of retreat and approaching liberation. Distant explosions grew louder, closer, more frequent. Soviet artillery rolled toward Warsaw like a relentless tide. Spielmann stayed hidden in the apartment, wrapped in the officer's oversized coat, listening to the walls tremble with every new barrage he survived on the last cans Hosenfeld had brought, rationing each spoonful with a discipline born of desperation. Then, one morning, the gunfire changed. It no longer sounded like oppression, it sounded like collapse. German shouts, once sharp and commanding, drifted away toward the western outskirts. Tracked vehicles rumbled in retreat. By afternoon, silence returned. But it was a different kind of silence. Not the silence of death, but the silence of a city preparing to breathe again. Cautiously, Spielmann stepped out of the apartment. The stairwell was frozen, littered with debris and footprints leading downward, the last traces of German withdrawal. Outside, the streets were unrecognizable, burned-out vehicles, collapsed facades, entire neighborhoods transformed into skeletal outlines against the winter sky. But in the distance, over the river, came the unmistakable thunder of Soviet armor. He moved slowly, limbs stiff from months indoors, until he reached a courtyard partially sheltered from the wind. He searched for any sign of civilian life. None appeared. Warsaw had become a hollow shell, emptied by occupation, uprising, starvation, and war. Yet somewhere inside that silence lived the memory of the music he once played, and the man who had allowed him to survive long enough to hear it again. On the morning of January 17th, 1945, the Red Army reached his position. Soviet soldiers approached cautiously, calling out in Russian. Spielmann raised his hands, struggling to speak. His voice cracked as he tried to explain who he was, that he was Polish, that he had been hiding. They carried him to a medical station, fed him warm broth, wrapped him in blankets. For the first time in months he slept without fear, but liberation carried a shadow. As he regained his strength, Spielmann asked again and again about German officers captured in the region. He searched names, units, prisoner lists. He hoped, desperately, that Hosenfeld had survived the retreat, that the officer who saved him might now be freed from the uniform that had concealed his conscience. But in the spring of 1945, news reached him. Hosenfeld had been taken by the Soviets, identified not by his diary or his acts of mercy, but by his rank he was sent to a prisoner camp deep in the east. Conditions were harsh, interrogations harshest of all. His letters home, when they came, were filled with quiet dignity and declining health. He did not survive captivity. For Spielmann, the realization struck with a grief shaped not by length of friendship, but by depth of humanity. He owed his life to a man the world had condemned without knowing, a man whose uniform had made him an enemy, but whose actions had restored a stranger's chance at life. Years later, Spielmann rebuilt his world through music. Concert halls filled once more with the compositions he had nearly taken to the grave. Each performance carried an invisible thread back to that frozen apartment in 1944, to the moment when a starving pianist played on broken keys for a German officer who listened with the conscience of a teacher he once had been. In interviews, Spielmann remembered him simply, quietly, without embellishment. "He helped me, at the risk of his own life." And with those few words, history carved a place for Wilm Hosenfeld beyond his uniform, beyond his duty, beyond the ruins of Warsaw. A place defined by the truth that, even in a war built on the destruction of humanity, one man looked at a starving stranger and chose to save him. A reminder that conscience can survive even the darkest empire, and that sometimes the smallest act of mercy is the one that outlives the war.